Have you ever noticed how time feels like it's speeding up as you get older? When you were a child, a single summer afternoon felt endless. You could build a fort, chase insects, invent entire worlds, and still have hours left before dinner. But now, weeks blur into months, and years seem to pass almost unnoticed. It's a strange feeling, and most people assume it's just part of growing up or getting busy. But if we look at it through the lens of physics rather than psychology alone, something far more interesting appears. What if the sensation of time accelerating isn't simply about aging bodies or packed schedules? What if it's tied to the way information flows through your brain, and even deeper, to the same physical laws that govern the universe itself? When physicists talk about time, they don't treat it as a simple ticking clock. Time in physics is measured by change. If nothing changes, then from a scientific perspective, time effectively stops. Imagine being trapped in a completely empty white room. No windows, no sounds, no motion, no changes in light or temperature. If nothing inside that room ever shifts, how would you know time is passing? You wouldn't. Time only becomes meaningful when something transforms, when matter rearranges, when patterns shift, when something new happens. This idea connects directly to entropy, the fundamental principle that systems naturally move from order toward disorder. Drop a single drop of ink into a glass of water and watch what happens. At first, the ink is neatly separated from the water, but soon it spreads, swirls, and dissolves into complex patterns. That transition from simple order to messy complexity gives the system a history. It creates a before and after. In physics, that change is what defines the arrow of time. Your brain works in a similar way. It constantly records changes in the world around you. But here's where things get interesting. When you're young, almost everything you encounter is new. Every experience is unpredictable, rich with detail, and full of unfamiliar patterns. Your brain treats this flood of novelty as valuable information, so it records it carefully. It stores textures, sounds, emotions, smells, and surprises. In a sense, it captures life at a very high resolution. Now imagine that your memory works like a camera, but not one with a fixed frame rate. Instead, it adjusts based on how much new information is coming in. When you're a child, the camera runs fast, capturing frame after frame of detailed experience. But as you grow older, your brain starts recognizing patterns. You've brushed your teeth thousands of times. You've walked familiar streets, heard familiar conversations, eaten familiar meals. Your brain realizes it doesn't need to record every detail anymore because it already knows the script. So the camera slows down. Instead of capturing every moment, it takes snapshots. A morning blur here, a commute there, dinner later. Large chunks of time get compressed into small amounts of stored memory. And here's the trick. When you look back on your life, you replay those memories at a constant speed. Childhood feels long because it contains many frames. Adulthood feels short because there are fewer. From the perspective of information theory, the perceived length of time depends on how much new information is stored during that period. More novelty means more memory density, and more density makes time feel longer. Less novelty means compression, and compression makes time seem to fly by. But this explanation only scratches the surface, because it raises a deeper question. Why does the brain start compressing experiences in the first place? And what does that have to do with the same physical laws that govern atoms, energy, and entropy across the universe? To answer that, we need to look more closely at the fundamental behavior of matter itself, because the same rules that guide the spreading of ink and water also shape the way your mind experiences time. To see why your brain begins compressing experience, we have to zoom all the way down to the level of atoms. Everything around you, including your thoughts, your memories, and your sense of time, is ultimately built from particles jiggling and interacting. Those atoms never sit still. They vibrate, collide, and exchange energy constantly. And when physicists study systems made of enormous numbers of particles, one rule appears again and again. Systems naturally drift toward the most probable arrangement, which usually means the most mixed and uniform state possible. Think again about that drop of ink in water. At first, the ink is organized in one place, a neat and unlikely configuration. But once it spreads, there are vastly more ways for the molecules to be mixed than to stay separate. Disorder wins simply because it has more possible arrangements. That is entropy in action, and it governs everything from cooling coffee to the formation of stars. Now, your brain, fascinatingly, is a structure built to fight entropy locally. It organizes incoming chaos into patterns. It builds predictions, compresses signals, and turns raw sensory noise into a manageable story about the world. When you are young, your brain hasn't yet built that story. It is mapping everything for the first time. Every face, every smell, every rule of social interaction must be learned from scratch. This means your neural circuits are physically rewiring themselves, strengthening connections, forming new pathways, and using a tremendous amount of energy to encode unfamiliar information. That heavy processing gives experiences weight. It stretches perceived time because your brain is storing a large amount of unpredictable data. Each new encounter is like a complex signal full of surprises. And information theory tells us that unpredictable signals carry more informational content. In other words, they leave deeper traces in memory. As you age, something remarkable happens. Your brain becomes a prediction engine. It learns patterns so well that it can anticipate outcomes before they occur. You no longer need to examine every letter in a sentence to understand it. You recognize shapes of words, tones of voices, routines of behavior. Instead of recording the full signal, your brain stores shorthand. It compresses reality. This is incredibly efficient. It allows you to navigate the world quickly, conserve energy, and respond smoothly to familiar situations. But that efficiency comes with a hidden cost. Compression removes detail, and without detail, memories lose depth. When you look back later, there is less information to replay, so the period feels shorter. Another way to picture this is through the idea of space-time as a block. Physicists often describe reality not as a flowing river, but as a solid structure containing all moments at once. Imagine slicing this block into thin cross-sections, each representing a moment in your life. For a child, those slices are wildly different from one another. One slice might contain a new taste, another a frightening moment, another a discovery. Each is unique and richly textured. But in a highly repetitive adult routine, the slices begin to look similar. If you stacked them up, they would blur together. From the standpoint of information, identical slices don't need to be stored separately. Your brain merges them into a single generalized memory. 5 years of routine can collapse into one vague recollection labeled, "That time I worked there." This merging is not a flaw. It's a feature. It's how the brain handles the overwhelming amount of sensory data it receives. Without compression, you would be paralyzed by detail. But compression alters your perception of duration. Time doesn't actually move faster. You simply retain fewer distinct markers to measure it by. Here's the strange paradox. The more predictable your life becomes, the faster it appears to pass. Order creates speed. Novelty creates length. And this mirrors the behavior of physical systems, where high-entropy states contain many indistinguishable configurations, while low-entropy states contain distinctive structures. So when your days become routine, you're effectively moving into a higher entropy mental state where many moments are statistically similar. Your brain records less information, and when you later reconstruct your memories, the timeline shrinks. But if that's true, then it suggests something powerful. If the perception of time depends on informational richness, then in principle, it can be altered. The flow of time in your experience isn't fixed by clocks or calendars. It is shaped by how much novelty, unpredictability, and meaningful change you allow into your life. And that realization opens a door, because it means the speed of time isn't just something that happens to you. It's something you can influence. Once you realize that time in your mind is really a measure of change, the whole story begins to look different. The clock on the wall doesn't tell you how long something felt. It only tells you how many seconds passed according to a mechanical device. But your brain is not a clock. It's a recorder of transformation. It cares about what changed, what surprised you, what forced your internal model of the world to update. This is why moments of crisis or excitement seem to stretch. Think about the last time something unexpected happened. Maybe you slipped on wet ground, almost fell, and caught yourself. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. You noticed the texture of the pavement, the position of your arms, the angle of your body. Your brain suddenly switched into high-resolution recording mode because the situation was unpredictable and potentially important. It needed data. From the outside, that moment lasted a fraction of a second. But internally, it contained a dense cluster of information. Your memory holds onto it vividly because your brain had to work hard to process it. Now compare that to a routine moment like sitting at a red light on your commute. You've done it thousands of times. Your brain already knows the pattern. Stop, wait, go. There's no need to record every detail. So it doesn't. The memory barely exists. Later, when you think back on the day, that entire stretch collapses into nothing. This tells us something crucial. Psychological time isn't about duration. It's about informational density. A single hour packed with novelty can feel longer than a whole week of repetition. From the perspective of physics, you could say your brain measures time not in seconds, but in bits of new information processed. And this brings us back to entropy again. In thermodynamics, entropy measures the number of ways a system can be arranged. In information theory, it measures unpredictability. Those two meanings are deeply connected. When something is highly ordered and predictable, its informational entropy is low. When it's complex and surprising, entropy is high. Your brain evolved to reduce uncertainty. It tries to transform a chaotic world into a predictable one. That's what learning is. That's what habit formation is. Every time you repeat an action, your brain refines its model until it can run the process automatically. This is incredibly useful for survival. You don't want to relearn how to tie your shoes every morning. But there's a side effect. As your brain becomes better at prediction, your life contains fewer surprises. And fewer surprises mean fewer recorded distinctions between moments. That's why years can blur together. Imagine two notebooks. One is filled with dense writing on every page. The other has only a few sentences scattered across many pages. Both notebooks might represent the same amount of chronological time, but when you flip through them, one feels thick and substantial while the other feels almost empty. Your memory works the same way. When childhood memories feel long, it's because that notebook was packed with detail. Everything was unfamiliar, so everything got written down. But adulthood often produces a sparse notebook. You might have lived through thousands of hours, but if most of them were predictable, your brain didn't bother recording much. This also explains why vacations seem longer than work weeks. When you travel somewhere new, your brain suddenly encounters unfamiliar streets, sounds, smells, and social cues. It has to process everything consciously again. It has to pay attention. The recording frame rate increases. When you look back later, those few days contain enough distinct information to feel like weeks. Routine, on the other hand, runs on autopilot, and autopilot doesn't record. It compresses. From a physics perspective, you could say your mind is constantly balancing two competing forces. One is efficiency, the drive to simplify the world into predictable patterns. The other is novelty, the injection of new information that forces those patterns to evolve. Efficiency saves energy, but novelty stretches time. The tragedy is that our culture often pushes us toward maximum efficiency. We build routines to save time, optimize schedules, automate tasks, streamline decisions. We do everything we can to remove unpredictability from our days. And in doing so, we unintentionally speed up our perception of life. We treat efficiency as progress. And in many ways it is. But psychologically, it's also compression. It reduces the number of distinct mental states you experience. So the question becomes, if efficiency compresses time, can intentional inefficiency expand it? And the answer, interestingly enough, is yes. Because what your brain needs to slow down time isn't more minutes on the clock. It needs more differences between those minutes. It needs novelty, complexity, and surprise. It needs your world to change in ways that force it to update its internal map. That doesn't mean you have to live in chaos. It simply means that if you want your life to feel long and rich rather than fast and blurry, You have to keep feeding your brain new patterns to decode. And once you understand that, the idea of slowing time down stops sounding like a fantasy and starts sounding like an engineering problem, one that depends on how you design the information flow in your life. Once you see time as information, the whole question stops being mysterious and starts becoming practical. It isn't that the universe secretly speeds up as you age. The clocks tick the same. The earth spins the same. The atoms vibrate with the same restless energy they always have. What changes is the number of distinct mental states you pass through as those atoms rearrange themselves. You can think of your life as a sequence of snapshots, not measured in seconds, but in transitions. Each transition is a change in your internal model of the world. When you learn something new, adapt to something unexpected, or notice a detail you've never seen before, you've created a new state. That state gets stored. Later, when you look back, those stored differences act like markers along the road, making the journey feel long and textured. But when nothing surprises you, when each day resembles the last, those markers disappear. The road collapses into a straight, featureless stretch. It's not that the time vanished. It's that your brain didn't bother to carve notches into it. This is exactly how compression works in computer science. If a file contains repeated patterns, it can be reduced drastically in size without losing essential meaning. A sequence like A can be stored as 6 A's instead of writing each one individually. Your brain uses a similar strategy. If your day consists of familiar routines, it stores the summary rather than the details. Efficient, yes, but that efficiency erases perceived duration. So the real question isn't, how do I stop time from moving fast? The real question is, how do I increase the number of meaningful distinctions in my experience? And that answer is surprisingly simple, though not always comfortable. You have to introduce novelty. You have to interrupt the patterns. You have to make your brain work again. Novelty doesn't have to mean dramatic life changes. It can be small disruptions. Walk a different route. Read a book outside your usual interests. Talk to someone you wouldn't normally talk to. Try to learn a skill that makes you feel clumsy and slow again. Each of these forces your brain to switch back into high-resolution mode. It has to record instead of compress. When you do this, something interesting happens. The day feels longer while you're in it. And later, when you remember it, it feels longer still. You've increased the informational density of your life. This idea lines up beautifully with the physics of entropy. Entropy measures how many distinct arrangements a system can have. When everything is uniform, entropy is high, but informational content is low because the system is predictable. When there are distinct structures and patterns, informational richness increases. Your mind thrives on that richness. It measures time by how much structure it encounters, how many surprises it has to integrate. The more variety in your mental landscape, the longer your timeline feels. And here's the paradox that makes this whole thing fascinating. We spend years trying to make life smoother, easier, more predictable. We want stability. We want comfort. We want routines that eliminate friction. But friction is what gives experiences weight. Friction is what creates the texture of memory. Without it, life becomes a polished surface that everything slides across too quickly. From the perspective of physics, you could say a life full of novelty keeps your internal system far from equilibrium. It keeps energy flowing through your neural circuits. It keeps your mental universe dynamic instead of static. And dynamic systems produce more distinguishable states, which means more perceived time. Equilibrium, on the other hand, is the end state of physical systems. When everything reaches the same temperature, when nothing changes anymore, time loses meaning because nothing happens. That is literally the predicted fate of the universe, a uniform, featureless equilibrium where no processes remain to mark the passage of moments. But you don't have to live like that now. Your brain is capable of generating complexity. It can create internal entropy by exploring new ideas, new environments, new perspectives. It can keep the timeline richly marked instead of smooth and blank. So maybe the secret to a long life isn't measured in years at all. Maybe it's measured in the number of times you allow yourself to feel confused, curious, or surprised. Maybe it's about how often you force your mind to wake up and say, "I've never seen this before." Because when that happens, Your internal camera speeds up, the frame rate rises again, and suddenly the afternoon stretches. The week feels full. The year gains depth instead of slipping past unnoticed. Time isn't just something happening to you. It's something your mind constructs from change. And the more change you allow yourself to notice, the more time you seem to have. So here's the real takeaway. If you want your life to feel long, don't just count the days. Fill them with differences. Jiggle the atoms of your routine. Let your brain struggle a little. Let it learn again. Because every time it does, you're not just gaining knowledge. You're stretching the fabric of your lived experience. And that, in the end, might be the closest thing we have to slowing time down. If this made you see your days a little differently, then keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep noticing the details most people rush past. Reality is richer than it looks, and the more attention you give it, the more time it gives back.